up and provide responses afterwards. Okay, so let's move on to the last section on related services documentation. We have a little bit of extra time, and I'm sure we'll likely have a very spirited conversation when it comes to related services documentation.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for sticking out this long with us. For this portion of the webinar, I will be covering non-compliance rates for related services, policy requirements, a refresher on logging services in SEDS, responsibilities for missed services, and related services management reports. If at any point I start to go too fast, I know I am a fast talker. Someone send a comment to the question box, and I will try to slow down. So data review. This chart shows non-compliance rates for the past 3 school years. Granted, I know that the 2014-2015 school year is only half over. One thing that needs to be taken into consideration is that less files are selected for review this school year, and not every non-public that has been visited this year has had students for a file review. That being said, the rate of non-compliance is extremely high. My hope is that this section of the webinar will help to provide some clarification in terms of the policy requirements and logging services. And then our team's hope is that the services are being provided. We assume for the most part that they are being provided, and just for whatever reason there's issues with logging and SEDS, or a provider might be unavailable. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to put up a poll question that hopefully will give us, the non-public team, a better understanding of some complications that come up for why services aren't being logged in SEDS. So I'm going to give everyone 30 to 60 seconds. Okay, so that closes out 1 minute, but I do see numbers are still coming in, so I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. Okay. Sure. Okay, so of the 64% of you that have voted, it's clear that service provider left or not yet hired is a factor. So we'll be going over the requirements of the IEP and making sure that you're implementing services as they're written in the IEP. If there is another factor that wasn't listed here, feel free to send a comment to the question box, and we'll just keep note of that, because it is helpful for us to know what's going on, because we only see what we see when we pull a report. So if it's not in SEDS, we have no real proof that something is happening, even though we assume that it is. Okay. I'm not scared. There we go. Okay. So moving into policy review, I'm going to review a couple of state-level regulations and OSCE's related service policy regarding to the implementation of related services. So right here I put in two regulations that come from Chapter 30 of the District of Columbia Municipal Regulations, or DCMR. I'm going to keep saying DCMR. I wanted to point these two regs out to you because as much as they're a DC reg, they're coming directly from the Code of Federal Regulations in the Individuals with Disability Act, IDEA. Related services that are provided to children with disabilities must be based on the student's unique needs and not just on the disability category. OSCE released the Related Services Policy in January of 2010. This policy outlines the provisions of IDEA and Chapter 30 of the DCMR. LEAs must provide related services to all eligible students with disabilities when services are needed for the child to benefit from special education. LEAs must maintain oversight of their students who are attending non-public programs. This ensures that eligible students receive special education and related services in accordance to their IEPs. LEAs approve access to their students in SEDS to the non-public school. And under the COA section of the DCMR, Chapter 28, non-publics must ensure that all data that is required by OSCE regarding a student attending a non-public is entered into SEDS timely and accurately. LEAs must participate in annual IEP meetings and ensure that appropriate related services are designated. LEAs must track progress reports for their students attending non-publics, and Chapter 28 of the DCMR states that non-publics shall monitor how students are making progress towards their annual IEP goals and provide that information not only to the LEA, but also to the parent or guardian at least quarterly.
So I just want to go back to the second one here. Approve the non-public schools access to SEDS for specific students. You know, the other day I attended a professional association meeting of non-public special education schools, and you know, I was very pleased to learn that the group of those non-public schools were all familiar with the new TA support model, where the LEA is the first line of support for the non-public school to address access issues in SED, and if there are any issues that aren't able to be tackled, that the OSCE support tool is used to try and troubleshoot, you know, whatever kind of access issues the LEA is not able to. So in that room of providers from the non-public schools, I was very pleased to learn that almost all of the providers indicated that they had been working with LEAs to, you know, troubleshoot issues. They knew who their LEA point of contact for SEDS was, and they were all familiar with the OSCE support tool. So, you know, it gives us some feedback in terms of, you know, the process that OSCE has been rolling out over the last couple of years to be able to provide, you know, more targeted support for access issues in SEDS. But, you know, with that said, again, make sure as a non-public school you're reaching out to your LEAs, the LEA point of contact for SEDS to troubleshoot individual issues, you know, when it comes to specific students. If there are issues having to do with aggregate account access, meaning that a non-public school provider, like a related service provider, serves students from different LEAs, or a non-public school themselves serves students from multiple LEAs, that those issues that need to get addressed go through the OSCE support tool as well. So we'll provide a link for those who are maybe not familiar with that process on the phone. And if there are LEAs who are on this call who feel like they need additional support, there are upcoming webinars and trainings for SED access. It's actually not just for LEAs, but for non-publics as well, and we'll get to that at the end.
Okay, and I wanted to note that I keep saying students who are attending a non-public school. Please remember that a student is enrolled in the LEA while they are attending the non-public. This is an important distinction to remember. If at any point a non-public is unable to implement any portion of the student's IEP, which includes related services, they must immediately notify the LEA in writing and consult on whether an IEP meeting is necessary. So for schools who might not have a service provider currently, whether they left or they're in the hiring process, you should be letting your LEA know immediately. So that way they're aware if a student is missing services. That way the two of you can create a makeup plan.
So there's a, I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, but it's actually a good segue into where we're going. Often the reports do not correlate with the service trackers that are in SED. In addition, there have been incidences when the service tracker is faxed into SED one day but disappears from the SED the next day. The reporting tool at times does not report the correct number of hours. So we're going to get into this in terms of, looking at ways to be able to ensure that student services are able to be delivered, and really it starts with SED. So, we're going to be covering access issues. We're going to be covering a related services management report that gets at it. But really, the first step is making sure that related service providers have access to SED for the students who are on their caseload.
Okay. So logging services in SEDS. This portion of the webinar may serve as a refresher for some of you, but for others it can be completely new, especially if you're not in there logging the services. I'm going to go through a step-by-step process of logging related service session and generating a service tracker. So to log a service, at the top of the screen in SEDS, you select Wizard. Then you should see the service you provide. So for this purpose, I was logged in as a speech-language pathologist. That's why you see SLP Logging Wizard. So you click on the SLP Logging Wizard, or you would see an occupational therapist logging wizard if you're an OT, etc. The screen that will open up should list all of the students who are on your caseload. Select the student or students that you would like to log a service for. Students will only appear on your list if they have a finalized IEP in SEDS with that particular service on the finalized IEP, and if the non-public SEDS point of contact has authorized you as one of the student's service providers. Every non-public school or campus should have a designated point of contact for SEDS. This is the person that will be able to grant you access to the student. That being said, if a LEA has not listed the students as attending your non-public in SEDS, the non-public point of contact should contact the LEA to gain access. All service tracker fields are required. So for date of service, you document the date or select on the calendar icon the date field. Date service was originally due. You would document the date the service was originally due if you're logging a makeup session. For service type, this will identify whether the service was provided to the student or whether the service was not delivered and why. And I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide. For duration of service, how long did the service last? If the service was not held, log the number of minutes planned for that session. The field should never say 0 minutes. So if you have a service that was scheduled and the student was unavailable or there was a school closure due to snow, you should still log this service. And for service type, you should indicate why. And then for service delivery, you would document if it was delivered or attempted. So for services that did not happen, it should say attempted. For services that did occur, it should say delivered. Group size, indicate the number of students attending a session, whether it's just one-on-one or if it's a group. For progress report, select the student's progress. And then in the comments section, enter the session notes. And this is where you would indicate if it was a makeup session or if the student was unavailable. Indicate why. And if it's a makeup session, I would recommend typing in the date of the original session, because when you pull a service tracker, you won't see whether or not it was a makeup session, so having it in the comments is really helpful. So once you've logged the service, a confirmation page will come up. Please read this page thoroughly. Once you select yes, log this service, the only way to go back and edit an error would be to contact the LEA and request that they delete the log, and then you would have to go back in and re-enter the log. All right, so generating a service tracker. It can be done in two ways. First, I will go over generating a batch service tracker for multiple students at once, which is obviously a time saver. And then secondly, I'll go over generating a service tracker for one student at a time. To generate a service tracker for multiple students, select the Wizards tab at the top of the SED screen, and then click on Service Tracker Wizard. Next, select the students from the case manager list or the team list. But before I go over the next page that pops up after you hit continue, I'm going to show you how to log for an individual student, just because once you hit that continue button, either way you go, you come to the same page. So to generate for one student, select the Students tab at the top of the SED screen, enter the student information, and hit Enter. Once in the student's record, select the Documents tab, and then select the radio button next to Service Tracker and click Create Final Document. So regardless of which route you take, you're going to come to this page. So you select the service period that the services were delivered. Your options are school year, ESY, or school year and ESY. Next, select the date range that you would like the service tracker to cover. And finally, select the service area. So examples would be speech-language pathology, occupational therapy, physical therapy, etc. And then create the final document. A hyperlink will appear to view the document, and so you select the hyperlink, and the service tracker is also now listed in the Documents tab for the student. Service trackers are not required to be signed. However, if you want to sign it, feel free to print and sign, then fax or upload the document into SEDS. And at the end of this portion of the slideshow, I do have an example of a service tracker that we're going to go over. So bear with me, and then I'll show you what one looks like if you're unfamiliar. So moving into responsibilities for missed services.
So there's a couple of questions having to do with what kinds of missed services need to be made up, and you'll be covering that in this section. So we'll get to some of your questions.
Okay. So what happens if a service is missed? Does it have to be made up? Do I log a makeup session? I'm going to be going over those types of questions, or they should be covered in this section. So OSCE's related services policy addresses missed services. All LEAs are required to have a related services policy of their own. This policy should be provided to parents as well as to non-publics. The policy should include the LEA's policy or procedure on missed services. Non-public schools are expected to follow the related director overseeing their services. If you, as the non-public or the LEA, want them to be signed by the person overseeing the services, that's fine. Feel free and just upload them in. There is that section, supervisor signature line on the service tracker.
There's another question about the unit of related services. So is it best practice to measure related services by the week or by the month on the IEP? For example, should the IEP read behavior support services 1 hour a week or 4 hours a month?
So that is really up to the IEP team, and it should be looked at student by student and service by service. If the student needs 60 minutes a month, whether you want to split that up into 30-minute sessions bi-weekly, that's up to the team. It's really the question you have to answer is the student going to regress? Are they going to be able to recoup if they're not being seen weekly? I know that for reporting purposes and making sure makeups are done, it might be easier to say 240 minutes a month, which would be 60 minutes a week. But what we don't want to happen is if the student is going to regress from their services and not able to recoup that you're not heavy loading services at the end of the month when it comes time to submit the documentation. So really, like I said, it's an IEP decision and whatever's best for the student. Okay, so documenting makeup services. If you're logging for a service that did not take place, sorry, I skipped ahead in my notes. So some of you may have been aware that there was or is going to be a makeup services checkbox. The makeup services checkbox was not deployed in the fall 2014 SEDS release. The date of deployment has yet to be determined. Continue to document makeup services using the date of original service in service delivery fields. You would fill out the service log entry the same way you would for a non-makeup service, with the exception of the date service was originally due box. Enter the date the service was originally scheduled, and then in the comments make sure to write that this service was a makeup service for and state the original date. The date the service was originally due field does not come up on a service tracker, but that putting it in the comments is extremely helpful. If you're logging for a service that did not take place in the service type, please select Y. What we do not want to see is direct service for 30 minutes and then in the comments it say that the student was absent or unavailable or school was closed, because it really wouldn't match.
So there's a question that's related to that comment. If a school is closed for a scheduled holiday, why are you selecting attempted when you really didn't attempt the service?
If you're supposed to be meeting with your student, you're scheduled to meet with your student on Monday, and it's President's Day, you should still log that service, and then when you make it up later on that week or the following session you tag on, you should be logging that. But by logging it as a service that was attempted, that's going to contribute to the calculations in the RSMR later on. Yes. Correct? So is that the rationale? That is the rationale. Why it should be logged as attempted rather than? Yes, that's my understanding from going through the different policies and talking to the training and technical assistance team that's how it should be logged. And that's why under service type, there is an option for school closure. But it enables more of an accurate calculation when we get to the related services management report. Yes.
And I think the system is just not nuanced enough to capture both types of school closures, planned school closures and unplanned school closures. So if it's an unplanned school closure due to weather, in theory, the school, would have attempted to provide the service, but couldn't because due to weather. So I think, it's just best to not, that the attempted was just a blanket term for all of those school closure items.
So going back, so if you select student unavailable, you should be writing Y. So if the student was on a field trip or in crisis or could not meet, etc. Same goes for provider unavailable or school closure. Just indicate that in comments. The minutes, again, should never be 0. If the service did not place, you will still want to log how many minutes you were scheduled to meet. If the service is missed, at minimum, there should be 2 logs for that service. a log for the service that was missed and a log for the makeup. Occasionally there could be more than two if you keep attempting to make up the service and things keep popping up like snow days, field trips, absences, school delays. Make sure you log your attempts to show due diligence in making up that service. So we're almost done, I promise. I'm going to go over running related service management reports, or RSMRs as we fondly call them. Help to ensure that services are being delivered. They maintain oversight and make sure that services are being delivered. I realize that there are other reporting mechanisms built into SEDS and ones that are probably better suited for running reports regularly that aren't as time-consuming. However, the RSMR provides a snapshot and is what the non-public monitoring unit uses to ensure services are being delivered in accordance with students' IEPs. So I realize that when we run them, we're running them for a specific time period, for a month or 4 weeks, whatever is in the student's IEP, and we're running them once. Whereas if you were to use it, you'd be running them multiple times. There is a way, and I'm not familiar with it, but we can get you information from SEDS to schedule reports, so like the RSMR or the Service Documentation Report, the SDR. The SDR is great, but for the non-public purpose, it's hard to do that for multiple students coming from multiple LEAs. We found that the RSMR is more accurate for us. To generate an RSMR or to generate other reports within SEDS, you go to the School Systems tab at the top, and then underneath that, select Reports. For generating an RSMR, select the Related Service Management Report Excel.
What happens if SEDS users, for example, either the non-public POC or a related service provider doesn't have access to or doesn't see in their interface an RSMR?
You should check, if it's a service provider, you should check with your non-public point of contact for SEDS, whoever the main SEDS user is at the non-public or the campus, and see if they are able to grant you access. If not, you would submit an OSSI support tool ticket to gain access. So these lists of reports here on the screenshot, in our dummy account, we have a dummy account to go in and practice and run through things. We have full access to a lot of different reports. On my own personal one, it's less, and it might be less, it's less depending on your user capabilities. So check with your head SEDS person on site at the non-public, and if they're not able to grant you that access, or if they don't have access, submit an OSSI support tool ticket. So when you click on the RSMR in Excel, again, I want to emphasize that you're clicking on the Excel one. This is the screen or the window that you'll see. So for date selection, you select weekly or monthly. And then the school year to review, make sure it's in the current school year that you want to pull it for. When I went in to do this, it was defaulted to 2013-2014. And then for week or month, depending on what you select at the top, you'll be able to see weeks or months with the year next to it, obviously, that you want to run the report for. For provider name, this is optional. If you, don't know the provider's name, if you're at the LEA, that's fine, or if there's multiple providers that could be providing services, or if you're pulling this from multiple disciplines, so not just behavior support services, you also want to look at speech-language pathology. You just leave it blank. That's why there's not an asterisk next to it. First,
can you speak to the difference between running it versus the week versus the month in terms of how we look at, our team looks at services?
We look at it based on what's in the student's IEP. Sometimes I'll pull it monthly and the numbers just don't add up. They're not clean because what's in the student's IEP is 60 minutes per week or 45 minutes per week. And the calendar, I mean, obviously February and March are exceptional. February is an exception, starting on a Monday, ending on months don't start on a Monday and end on a Friday. So when you're pulling it monthly, those numbers aren't going to look as clean. But really, you're better off pulling what's based on the student's IEP. So however it's documented that services should be delivered, you want to pull it that way.
So when we run our RSMR reports, we run them in 4 week-long periods for the month, so that we're kind of getting a uniform kind of capture of students' related services across those 4-week periods. So again, with some of the calendar issues that you just described, it kind of eliminates that. And again, that's important in terms of how we use it to evaluate compliant practice in this area.
Okay. So for school, you want to make sure you're selecting the right campus if you have multiple campuses that the student is attending. And then for discipline, you can either check all or select specific discipline or disciplines that you want to review. For school category and cluster, that's optional. For our purposes, we just leave it blank. That way it'll pull everything. And then report options, you want to select Excel raw output. If you were to select PDF, it's very pretty, but you can't sort the data, you can't manipulate it in any way, especially if you're pulling multiple disciplines and you want to look at one student's services or look at all services, behavior support services for all students. You can't manipulate the report, so it's helpful to pull it in Excel. Then you click the Generate Report. To view the report or reports, especially if you're pulling weekly, you would go to the My Reports tab at the top of the SED screen. The reports are listed newest to oldest, so the one on the bottom, that was the very first week that I pulled. The second week is the one right above that. Unfortunately, they don't put down the date range or when you pulled it, but that's just how they're organized. So when you click on the hyperlink, the document will open in Excel. So I'm going to switch over to Excel. That's not showing. Okay, so what you're seeing, you'll get, if you're pulling like I did for 4 weeks, you're going to get 4 Excel documents. I copy and paste them into one document just to make life easier for me. But if you are pulling for multiple LEAs, you might want to do week 1, DCPS, week 1, Community Academy. However you want to sort it, this is just easier for me to view. So what you'll see is on, it disappeared. Why does that keep happening? Apologize, folks.
There you go.
Okay, but can I play with it? Yes, okay. So, and I only pulled for 1 student because I have 1 dummy account student. What you'll see is for the IEP date, they are prescribed 30 minutes a week of speech-language pathology. Because again, I was in there as a speech-language pathologist. So for week 1, prescribed 30 minutes, but 0 were delivered. So I scroll over to look to see if there is a reason that was given. So it says student unavailable 30 minutes. Okay, so there we go. And then week 2, prescribed 30 minutes were delivered. Week 3, prescribed 30 minutes were delivered. Week 4, prescribed 30 minutes, it says 0 delivered, so I look over as to why, and it says school closure. Occasionally, especially for up top where it says student unavailable, we'll go in and look to see if there is a service tracker. look at the comments, see what was going on. There's not always a service tracker to look at. They're not always in there. They're not always in there where we expect them to be. So we report just on what is in the RSMR. And that's when we have that 10-day window after the initial report's released where you guys can come back to us and say, no, here's the service tracker. Sorry, it wasn't generated. This explains what was going on. So I take this Excel document and I make it a little bit prettier. And I'm not, yep, there we go, cool, it did work. So I take what's listed for each student and I will list out all the students, where they attend, and we just use this for our own, just to keep track of the numbers. So for this student, dummy student number 2 was prescribed 30 minutes a week of speech-language pathology, prescribed per period. So for the 4-week period, that's 120. It says screen sharing is now paused. You guys see me? No. Can you see me? Yes. Yes. Okay. Sorry. So prescribed per period, 120 minutes for that 4-week period. Absences or school closures, 30 minutes. Notice how it doesn't say student unavailable. And then services as required, 90, because if there's an absence or the school is closed, we minus that 30 from the prescribed per period, so it goes down to 90 minutes. Services delivered, 60. So only 60% of the students' prescribed services were delivered. So if we look back at that other spreadsheet, which that's awesome, it popped up. Up at the top, that 30 minutes, school or student unavailable. It doesn't take that into account. If it was student absent, it would. So again, this is where we would attempt to go and look at the service tracker. Maybe services were attempted to make up a few times, and it didn't happen. So going back to my slides, I have a copy of the service tracker. So looking at the service tracker, student unavailable, and we look at the comments. Student was in crisis, refused services. Okay, noted. Week 2, direct service for 15 minutes, and again, I look at the comments just because prescribed 30, so why is it shortened? Student was uncooperative after 15. We'll try to make up services later this week. And then you see a couple days later, service, those 15 minutes were delivered. But you'll note in my scribble of comments that it didn't put the makeup or the original date of service. That's helpful to put in the comments, especially if you're making it up. Say you originally were to have services February 23rd, and you ended up making them up into March, but you're pulling the service ticket or service tracker for the month of February. You won't see that on that service tracker. You see it in the March one. So having that in the comments is helpful.
So where would the service tracker here, for which date would the comment?
So for the one on February 5th, where my random scribble is for comments, you should have put makeup service for, or service originally planned for February 2nd, something along those lines. February 9th, services as delivered. February 17th, school closure. So what I'm not seeing that was not made up is the student unavailable from January 26th. So had that had been made up, the service tracker, the related service management report would have said 100%. Okay, so that's the end of my section. Are there any? There's lots of questions.
Okay, so let's start back. Our staff put put information into SEDS, but when we go to fax the signed document into SEDS, it does not show up, even though our fax machine states that it was received. So a couple of things here. There is now, as part of the SEDS 7.5 functionality, or 7.0 functionality, documents are also able to be scanned and sent into the system as well. So there's an additional way, in addition to faxing, if that hasn't been working, to be able to register documents. You know, if there are technical issues that result in a fax document not getting uploaded because it's not received or registered, again, that's an OSSI support tool ticket to try and troubleshoot what that issue is.
It's from my understanding that when you are logging the service, it should show up on a report regardless of if a service tracker is generated or not. I realize that there are glitches with SEDS and that services logged do not always appear and they sometimes disappear. I get that. It's not a perfect system. But you shouldn't have to generate a service tracker for the service to be logged within the system to show up on a report.
So there was another question. You've listed a 95% non-compliance rate for related services. If a particular non-public has been non-compliant in this area, would the school have been contacted, and if so, by who? Yes. The answer is yes. So the non-compliance rates throughout have been based upon on-site monitoring findings. So any monitoring finding where we have discovered, you know, non-compliance, those non-public schools and the associated LEAs have been contacted about that.
Yeah, we're not going in and looking at your school regularly. We do it for the on-site monitoring unless we are made aware or there's a complaint that comes in stating that services aren't being provided or whatever the case may be. Then we would do what we call a response to incident, and part of that would probably involve us monitoring related services through a RSMR.
If a school is closed for a scheduled holiday, oh no, I read that one already. Can you please share what days do and do not have to be made up? For example, school closure, holiday, if a holiday falls on a day when the related service provider is slated for a given service. Or if the service provider provides services on a Monday, but there's a holiday on Monday. Is this policy in writing that I can share with my related service team?
So this should be a part of a LEA's related service policy. So if you don't have a copy of your LEA's related service policy, I suggest getting a copy of it. If it's not in your policy, LEA's, I would add it in there because non-public should be following what you would like them to do in these cases.
So, and that's above and beyond the explicitly stated related services policies that are on the OSSI website. We've got links at the end of the presentation for the related services policy, along with non-regulatory guidance, which are a set of FAQs having to do with related services. What we recognize is that the related service provider policy that OSSI puts out indicates that for missed sessions, that each LEA needs to be able to define what that policy looks like for their LEA and for non-publics who serve students from their LEA, and you know, it leads to a little bit of a kind of gap, but the expectation is that the LEA is reviewing and is familiar with the DCMR policy with regard to related services, and then provides above and beyond that any policy that they have about what days need to be made up. There's a question about, you know, hopefully I'm talking loud enough. Let me know if I'm not. Is best practice? I already read that one. So another question. Did you say service trackers are not required to be printed and signed and faxed back in? We were told they have to be signed for funding purposes. Another question. Service trackers are not required to be initialed, signed, and faxed into SEDS. Is this a requirement that could be required by the individual LEA, or is this an OSSI requirement?
Okay, and I think I answered that when we were going through the presentation. It's not, as far as all of us are aware, it's not an OSCE requirement. So if the LEA does want to have them sign, then you should be following what the LEA is requesting. In terms of funding, we know the Medicaid recovery unit does not require them to be signed.
Is no longer required.
No longer, sorry, no longer.
Yeah, so there had been a previous requirement for Medicaid to have signed service trackers, but Medicaid is no longer requiring that. The OSCE, one of our colleagues from OSCE wrote, the OSCE invoice verification team does require make-up service supporting documentation to validate related service payments as the frequency documented on the IEP is closely reviewed. Therefore, any overages during the invoice period must be explained and supported. Not sure if a school is scheduled to be closed, we've been told that service does not need to be made up. Is that correct?
Again, check with the LEA that you're serving, or the LEAs that you're serving.
Okay, so here's some questions related to SEDS and SEDS functionality. Is it possible for the next SEDS update for a drop-down option to say holiday school closure? Could the term be changed from attempted to unable to be delivered?
Yeah, we'll notify the appropriate people and suggest that.
And pass that information on. So, you know, the SEDS development process is an ongoing process. Do you want to talk a little bit, Cassandra, about SEDS 8.0 in terms of related services, missed sessions, or out? So in SEDS 7.5, part of the functionality that was expanded was to be able to track the date back to when the service was originally missed. And isn't SEDS 8.0 slated to have additional functionality with regard to making up how make-up sessions are tracked in SEDS?
All I know is that there was supposed to be a checkbox at the top when you're logging the services saying this was a make-up service. It was not put out with 7.0 or what was recently released with
7.5.
7.5. It might be released with 8.0. What I've been told is it's a yet to be determined date, but it is something that they're planning on doing. We just don't know if they'll roll it with 8 or 8.5, but we know that it's coming. They are building that functionality.
If the student is sick, are we required to make up the service?
So student absent, that would be an LEA question, but for when we pull the RSMR, student is absent, it would subtract. So student absences, no, but staff absences, yes. But again, check with the LEAs that you are providing for if they want it to be made up. The question comes into FAPE. So if a student is regularly absent or regularly refusing services, and it's noted and it's documented, that should really be an IEP team's decision. Is the service still needed? How can we provide the service? Does a new service provider need to be delivering the services? Maybe there's a relationship breakdown between the student and the current service provider. But that all goes back to the LEA and the IEP team.
So the service should be attempted to be made up, offered to the student, and in a case where a student is refusing services, as Cassandra just said, you know, there are IEP processes to address that. So that was actually one of the questions: are they required to be made up? And that should be, at the very least, a consultation with the LEA, and then potentially an IEP team decision to determine whether you know, modifications need to be made to the student's IEP-related services.
Yeah, and I have seen that on service trackers when monitoring, and that's why it's really helpful to not just select from the drop-down student unavailable, to actually put in the comment section why. Okay, student was in crisis today, student was refusing services the next attempt. field trip, whatever the case may be. It's just helpful to have that in the comments section.
Another question, does the RSMR report aggregate all service provided across all providers of the discipline or across all providers at the non-public school? So if 2 SLPs provided SL services for one student for 1 month, will this report capture that?
Yes, so that's where it said for provider, we leave it blank because we don't always know who the exact provider is, especially if there's 2 providers, but it will show multiple services. So I've pulled before for a student or for a school for monitoring and see the student's name listed twice and the service as the same, so I'll sort it by service just to make life easier. And it's because there was 2 different providers in the same week. That's fine. It will show that when we pull the RSMR. So that is noted and accounted for.
Would the RSMR reflect related services prescribed monthly? Does OSSI require weekly services versus monthly services?
So it depends on how we pull it, and we pull the RSMR based on what's in the student's IEP. But again, monthly versus weekly, that is an IEP team decision of how you want services to be provided in the IEP.
And that's actually addressed in more detail in the related services non-regulatory guidance. So at the end, you'll see the links to that.
Yeah, there's an FAQ that went out with the related OSSI's related service policy.
Let's see. I'm trying to find some other questions to make sure we've answered them. What do you do if you service a student for the month, but there's still 1 more week in the month? So that might be like one of those 5-week sessions, 5-week calendar sessions. So the RSMR, if you run an RSMR, it will calculate the number of minutes for that particular month, if you're running it by the month, that the student should receive services. So that's what you should be basing your service provision off of. So if you're saying that you've serviced a student for the month based upon, the student receives 60 minutes weekly of behavior support services, and it's a 5-week month, it may be that the RSMR would calculate that as 200 and, what would it be? 300 minutes. Thank you. 300 minutes as opposed to 240. So that should guide your service provision, not just because you've seen them once each week in the month. Let's see, just trying to go through these. We've been unable to access the policy for making up sessions. So you'll see the OSSI guidance on that in the links that are contained at the end of this presentation. So that's where you should start, and then you should be reaching out to each of your LEAs to get their policy on making up sessions. Let's see. Can we get info about MA not requiring signatures in writing? I'm guessing that's Medicaid. Or direct us to the link. Yeah, we can follow up on that because I'm not sure how we get you that specific information. Why complete service trackers if signatures/initials are no longer required?
Well, the LEA that you're servicing may require you to. When you get a finding for noncompliance, say something's not coming up in the RSMR as being provided, and to submit proof that services did happen, service trackers are very helpful.
And it's just a reader-friendlier version of the data that you're inputting into the system.
Because you notice on the RSMR, the comments aren't there. Like on that Excel spit out from SEDS, the comments aren't there. So if you want to be able to show your comments, or if your clinical director wants to see them, or whoever's in charge of speech language or OT or behavior support services wants to see your comments that you entered into SEDS, that is a very helpful way to do that.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. We've got a couple more questions that we're going to take, and then we're going to wrap up. If school was extended due to make-up days for inclement weather, or spring break was shortened to make-up days, however, the missed sessions from the school closures days were already made up, would the students still be required to be seen during these make-up days?
That would, again, I would refer to the LEA's policy.
And also the student's IEP. If it's per week and the student's in school, I don't know. Never mind.
Well, no, actually, not knowing is actually a good answer, because I think what this question really illustrates is that the nuances in terms of looking at this, at least from our kind of compliance lens, are pretty nuanced. And you know, as we look at and we run RSMR reports, we recognize that there are a lot of factors that can affect, you know, the numbers that are calculated. Part of what the 10-day period between the initial report release and the final report release is designed to do is to use that to provide information to OSSI that, you know, services have been provided according to the student's IEP for this particular item. You know, one of the objectives of this webinar today was really to go over the running of the RSMR, and you know, it would be really interesting to know how many LEAs are using RSMR reports to, you know, track the service provision of their students in non-public schools, and also how many non-public schools are using it to ensure that they have delivered the services basically using the same lens that OSSI looks at when we do our on-site monitoring. So hopefully we've been able to cover enough of that in detail to provide you with a primer on the course. One of the other questions was how can we find out about who does training for related service logs online? And it's a really good segue into our wrap-up, and we'll get to that in a minute. But what's important here, folks, is that, you know, as we do our on-site monitoring, as we review related services, you know, we're trying to provide you with the tools that we use so that you can be proactive. So, you know, as I said, the window, that 10-day window between initial report release and the final report release of on-site monitoring findings, that isn't the first opportunity to be able to provide us with information about related service provision. Hopefully you're made aware of the methodology that we use, where as we're doing our on-site monitoring, we're providing you well in advance the students who will be reviewing. We're communicating to you about the month that we will be reviewing for related service provision. So it gives non-public schools, and more importantly their LEAs, the information that they can run an RSMR before we ever actually review student files to look at whether services were delivered, and to be able to flag for us, if it's not obvious, where make-up sessions were, or if there are nuances around, you know, why student services weren't provided. You know, some of those answers from the poll question before indicated some of the things that we've encountered from our discussions with non-public schools about some of the challenges that they have with access, with staffing. We get that, but at the same time, what's important is that what OSSI is able to see when we're using our you know, compliance lens to look at related services, what steps has the non-public taken to ensure that student services have been delivered according to the IEP? And, you know, again, long before we get there, you have the ability to run RSMRs to be able to look at those services. We recently had a meeting with a non-public school preparing for on-site monitoring, and one of the things that was impressive was that several of the LEAs had already been having conversations with that non-public school about their students, and having done reviews using the monitoring tool. And, you know, some of the questions we got at that meeting, you know, had to do with looking at the RSMR, we went over how we run the RSMR, and they were able to kind of look at service provision with the lens that we had. So that's a process that we're happy to talk through with schools preparing for on-site monitoring. But the expectation is these tools here today that we've begun to share with you provide you with the ability to look at the service delivery the way we look at it.